In this session, we'll be talking about how we might bring these apparently contradictory views, a developmental view and fruitional view, to actual therapeutic work. I might mention that, as I said before, my own personal experience was that I began a very traditional doctoral program in clinical psychology and left very quickly, and after a number of years found a way to return to therapy through my Buddhist practice and study. In my life, both of these ways of working have been incredibly powerful and valuable. I remember when I was in 9th grade, for the first time, I was able to actually have some clarity and put some words to something I didn't like about my mother and said, "You're being defensive." And I was so sort of pleased that I could label it in that way and had some understanding. So it's always been helpful for me to be able to look beneath the surface, to look beneath the display of things and be curious about larger issues, unconscious dynamics. But I wasn't really able to pursue therapy beyond a certain point without, as I said, returning to that work, that livelihood from my Buddhist practice. In Buddhism, I found an attitude and a whole range of skillful means that would allow me to practice psychotherapy with a sense of mutual dignity, curiosity about health rather than pathology, a sense of humor, not taking things so seriously, and a sense of a very deep vision about what's actually in our potential that goes deeper than, as Freud at one point said, just needing to end up with ordinary human unhappiness. So this dialogue between the therapeutic view and the Buddhist view has been very alive and very life-giving to me for many years. And I've found that for many of the people I work with, it seems to be very valuable. Means and a depth of vision. So just as a very short recap of what we have talked about, the developmental view looks at how, as children, we all have to be aggressive to certain aspects of ourselves in order to survive and function well as children in our unique families of origin and life circumstances. This is a very necessary self-aggression. It allows us to function and to get the greatest amount of support, love, approval possible. But the price tag is that it creates a basic sense of being divided first of all, idea and later experience that there is no split. Any experience of being split against ourself, divided against life, is created and maintained through a lot of effort, moment after moment. So that rather than trying to create an improved experience, an improved sense of self, the basic attitude is to learn to relax into our human experience as it already is, and find out for ourselves whether there's actually any problem. So in this session we're going to be talking about how to hold both of these views in therapeutic work with no fantasy of resolution. There's no intention to integrate or to create a synthesis. Rather, it's maintaining a type of dialogue or alternation of view and approaches, and just see what happens, basically. No guarantees, no formula. Both of these views have a common intention to relieve unnecessary suffering. and as we talked about, both have an idea that this experience of basic split is at the heart of unnecessary suffering. So there is an overlap. There are a lot of things in common, and there's significant differences also. In practice, this alternation takes the form of developmental work intending to increase one's tolerance of experiential intensity through a variety of understandings, techniques, relationship experiences. If you recall Jung's quote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering, or, as I would say, experiential intensity, then obviously if we can increase our tolerance of experiential intensity, we decrease our impulse to escape from the immediate truth of our experience. We begin to actually dissolve neurotic organization. So, for example, if I'm working with somebody who reports that their partner yells at them and they just shut down and they're not sure if they can stay in the relationship, obviously that reflects a lack of tolerance of an intense experience which is triggered by their partner's aggression. A Western therapeutic question, of course, would be, well, is this response to intensity something that's unique to that situation, one's partner's aggression, or is it something that might be familiar in all of one's life? That's a common question I ask people. And if somebody's response is very intense, very reactive, very extreme, very physical, usually that's a signal that this is an issue that's been with that person all of their life, had its origins in childhood, and perhaps will be with them till they die, because these core vulnerabilities are very embedded and don't just go away. So a developmental approach, a Western approach, would be then to begin to call attention to the possibility that this is a pattern in somebody's experience. They had it before they got into a relationship. If they were to end the relationship, they'd probably still have this issue. So it's probably helpful for them to work with their experience of being attacked, being yelled at. As soon as somebody's willing to look at their vulnerability as the issue, how they relate to their vulnerability, they already have begun to stop making the other person or making life circumstances, making the past, the cause of one's experience. It's of course true that life is always going to trigger us, but one's partner's aggression, if it's a trigger to a pre-existing vulnerability, is only a trigger and not a cause, then it will never be a solution. So it turns out to be to one's own benefit to investigate how can I increase my tolerance of this very intense response I feel. Often memories come up, perhaps of being yelled at or criticized by a parent, perhaps of some very intense experience in somebody's life. But the actual work is to then learn to increase the tolerance of that experience, to then start to experiment with a variety of ways to reduce the frequency with which that occurs, perhaps by negotiating with one's partner, communicating with them, making requests, changing one's own behavior. For example, if we really can't handle a very intense interaction, we don't really have to participate usually. Every once in a while, it's very difficult to remove ourselves, but the bottom line is usually we do not have to participate in dynamics that we can't handle well. So we get more intellectual understanding, we get more behavioral sort of tools to use, we become more familiar with what that experience feels like in our body, and hopefully gradually we learn to stay more engaged and therefore even more intimate with one's partner or even with life, because we can gradually increase our tolerance of the intensity that intimate engagement with life is guaranteed to bring us. The fruitional work has less to do with developing this range of skillful means and insights, and it has more to do with a returning over and over and over again to whatever we are experiencing in that immediate moment. When we do so, it's very important in my experience to be as curious as possible and check it out. Where is the evidence that there's a problem? I feel like I'm going to be annihilated when my partner yells at me. It actually feels that way. But if I can stay present, not go into my story about what's going on, about how it's so unfair and I never yell at that person and I'm so reasonable and they're not. If we can just stay in the immediacy of our experience, then we have an opportunity to ask ourselves, so it's not the therapist's belief system, it's that person's immediate intuitive intelligence at work. Where's the problem? Where's the damage? Is it killing me to feel this panic? Am I becoming dysfunctional? Do I think it's making me sick? And these are all legitimate questions. It's not like there's a right answer, but almost everybody, when they are willing to stay embodied in their immediate experience with whatever degree of intensity, finds out that actually no harm is happening to them. And this includes, of course, even our dissociative response. So if somebody reports resistance to feeling their vulnerability, then I invite them to just stay embodied with their experience of resistance. That's their immediate experience. It's not like they're supposed to break through and feel their vulnerability. If they can't get out of their thoughts, that's fine. Just experience what that's like without perhaps getting too fascinated by the content of those thoughts. What does it feel like to be up in your head that way? Is that a problem? So in the fruitional approach, we're always returning to immediacy. We're always checking it out and holding up into contrast our immediate experience from our familiar claim that there's something problematic about that immediate experience, and in a larger sense, of course, about us. So the developmental approach could be understood as a gradual approach, the fruitional approach as a sudden approach. Within Buddhism, these are two traditions, actually. There are schools that advocate for the gradual approach to enlightenment or the sudden experience of enlightenment. An image that I like, that's very classic, is of the apple on the tree. At some point it drops, but of course it has been ripening. So there's both the gradual and the sudden at all times, actually. We could also use the language of being and becoming. The developmental approach is about becoming. We're always looking for ways to improve our experience, which is very legitimate, of course. But if it's becoming without being, then we're always postponing our sense of being, which has to do with relaxation, acceptance, being at peace in the immediate moment, all of those qualities. We're always postponing our experience of being until we have accomplished our various conditions. But if our investment is in becoming, then of course there's never going to be any resting spot. So in our culture, of course, that's a very pervasive source of a lot of confusion and suffering, that everybody seems to be, to some extent, trying to generate a set of life circumstances, or on a more subtle level, to generate a better state of mind so that then they can finally accept themselves. They can finally fully be here present. But if our whole investment is in the mode of becoming, then of course that time will never come. On the fruitional side, the focus is on being, on surrender, acceptance, immediacy. But of course, there isn't only being on a certain level, because over any collection of moments there is a stream of experiencing, or as many people are paying attention to now, that stream of experiencing actually seems to have an evolutionary quality. Our whole universe all of the evidence suggests, is an evolutionary process. So even though at any moment there is being, over time there is always becoming. Even though we focus on the over time goals, there's always being. You can't have one without the other. Perhaps a way to make that point in a more simple example, we could say, well, high and low. Obviously, you can't have high without low. They co-define each other. You can't have low without high. They're relational. So a Buddhist point of view is that all experiencing is relational, that there's no essential nature, independent nature to any experience. So the fruitional view tends to just return over and over again, and what we find turns out to be very much the same thing pretty much all the time. We might feel anxious, we might feel activated, we might feel sort of sad, but after a while we are very clear that it's sort of always the same thing that we're finding, just our human nature there. From the point of view of development, becoming, we're always looking for how to evolve, how to improve, which is, of course, very important. So if we wanted to, just as an image, we can combine those two sort of views and imagine that the fruitional view has more of a circular type of representation. We're always circling around the same issues. We say, well, I'll probably work with this until I die, so might as well have a relationship with it, see if it's a problem. The developmental view is more linear. We're trying to get from here to there, trying to improve things. So if we were to combine the circle and the line, we could imagine an ascending spiral where we're circling around things and things are evolving also. And we could imagine that the vertical lines of that ascending spiral could be considered to be our core issues that we'll continue to hit over and over again. They're not going to go away, but hopefully at greater and greater levels of maturation and awareness and skillfulness. Another way that I talk with people sometimes is to invite them to consider that at any moment, if they want to work on both sides of this sort of apparent contradiction, that they could consider approaching their experience as a two-step sequence. The first step in our culture that seems to be important to begin with is that of acceptance, being present with the way things are. The next step, of course, is then, now from that ground of acceptance, how can I improve the situation, my experience? So a question I might ask somebody, if they're interested in that experiment, would be, how would it be to be who you are right now with all of your confusion and limitations and clarity and the whole business, as if it will never, ever get any better? How would it be to accept your relationship as if this is it? It will never get any better. The reason I ask that question, of course, is not actually about the future. Who knows what will happen? Of course, we're going to always try to be improving the quality of our experience for ourselves and others' benefit. But the point of that question is to direct people's awareness to what it feels like to invite that type of claustrophobia of not giving ourselves a little exit that allows us to not be fully committed to our immediate experience. And some people actually respond with relief with that idea. Oh, gosh, I'm exhausted trying to always make things better. A lot of people respond with a type of panic. What? I can't accept the way things are. This isn't okay. But then in our discussion, they may become clear that they're really saying, well, I am choosing to be here, but I have a complaint about it. I'm not going to be fully engaged until things become like I want them to be. So I'm here, but I'm not really here. And that describes, of course, a lot of us in our engagement with life in general. So it's a very interesting question we could all ask ourselves. What would it be like if this is it? It never got any better. And then, again, the point of that question is to watch our emotional response. What would it be like to be completely committed to this present reality? Because that's actually what we're experiencing right now. The next step, of course, would be then, if we want to improve a situation, well, we should go for that. We should give it a try. But if we've already accepted things as they are, ourself as we are, then any efforts of improvement could actually be understood and perhaps even experienced basically as play. We're doing it for fun. We're doing it because we want to, not because we have to. There's nothing at stake here in terms of some fundamental workability of our life. So let's say somebody is living in their home. It has running water, heat, shelter. It's okay. It's adequate. They have a bed. They have the whole basic setup. They don't really need anything more. So if they could imagine accepting their home as it is, then if they wanted to remodel the kitchen, add a sunroom, whatever, do some landscaping, it's all for fun, actually. It's not a requirement. There's not our sort of well-being at stake, because we've already accepted that our well-being is completely at home with the way things already are. And of course that applies to our own personal work. What would it be like to just really be committed to who we are in this present moment, and then understand that any work we do, therapy work, spiritual work, whatever, is basically for fun. It's not necessary. Down the road, we might extend our understanding and actually be committed to that work for the benefit of all of us. But initially, that's not really most people's motivation. Most people initially are trying their best to take care of themselves, which is the appropriate place to start in my experience. So these two very basic approaches, developmental, fruitional, we could say being, becoming, a lot of people use different language to point toward the same sort of apparently contradictory way of trying our best to live our life well. These contradictory energies or feelings, ideas, are just one example of a larger principle, which is the ability to hold contradictory energies, feelings, ideas simultaneously at all times with no fantasy of resolution. That's something that I often talk with people about in terms of their actual emotional work. Somebody may have an idea that, in fact, in our discussion on relationships, we'll return to this, but it's a very, very common idea in our culture. I find that people feel a certain type of pressure that they're supposed to be close to their partners. But obviously, in an intimate relationship, we don't only feel close. With our kids, we don't only feel close. But a lot of people have this idea that their behavior is supposed to represent only one feeling. And if they have contradictory feelings, they get a little anxious or confused and try to resolve those feelings so they only feel one way. Oh, but I'm supposed to feel close to my partner. I want to feel close. Isn't that what a relationship is about? Feeling positive, supportive, warm, and everything. But no, not actually. So it might be more accurate, let's say, that I want to be close to my partner. I don't want to be close to my partner. I love my partner. I hate my partner. I want to change. I don't want to change. Most people, not everyone, but most people, when they actually give themselves permission to consider holding and valuing contradictory feelings with absolutely no demand to resolve them, experience a significant relief, because it represents how they actually feel. It's like, for many people, it's like a type of permission to just be the way they already are, which really is at the heart of the fruitional view or approach. The deeper understanding of this capacity to hold contradictory feelings simultaneously with no fantasy of resolution is that as we are increasingly able to have that experience, we find that our sense of self, which isn't quite right, our awareness, actually ends up in the middle. We're actually unable to say that either is how we feel. We can't take refuge in identifying with either side of our feelings because they're both true. So just very organically, we end up in this sort of unresolvable middle ground. Buddhism is sometimes referred to as the middle way, the middle path. And my understanding is that that doesn't mean we take half of this and half of that and just end up in a homogenized middle ground, but actually that we develop the capacity to not take refuge in any formula, any position, and end up in this open middle ground where there's no support for personal identity, no objective confirmation ever that we're doing it the right way. Obviously, from an identity point of view, an egoic point of view, that can be quite disturbing, especially at first. But the benefit is that we are able then to just show up without a preconceived formula about how to live our life, how to perceive things. We begin actually to experience the reality that every moment is fresh. It's open. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know the right way to do it. We can't even come up with a resolved feeling about things that are important. We always have these contradictory feelings. So on a more subtle level, working in therapy by holding both the developmental and the fruitional views in itself is a fruitional approach. One of the interesting things that comes up in this type of discussion with people is that obviously we still have to act. In fact, every second we do act in the world. Even not acting is a choice about action. And every time we act, we have to represent some aspect of our experience. So once we're willing and able to hold contradictory experience and then realize we have to act anyway, it becomes very clear very quickly that none of our choices for behavior, for life circumstances, is going to capture the complexity of our feelings. If I choose to spend my money on this, I don't get it on that. If I live in this community, I don't get to live in another community. If I try to live in both communities, there's something else I'm not able to do. So there's a certain loss of complexity when we translate or manifest our feelings with life. We never get to represent both sides of these feelings at the same moment. We don't get to choose anything without, by implication, choosing not to have 10,000 other things. But a lot of people in our culture especially seem to be working with the idea that they're supposed to be able to have a life without disturbance, without limitation. Again, we've talked about our cultural idea of freedom as an absence of limitations. So this is disturbing to some people. It's especially disturbing, I've found, to people with histories of, let's say, toxic loss, divorces, self-absorbed parents, being ignored because you're one of, 8 or 9 kids, whatever the circumstances. When somebody has a very difficult experience of loss, especially when it was done to them rather than of their choice, then often they have a lot of disturbance, panic even, about being responsible for consciously making choices. And some people actually then end up using ambivalence as a form of defense against loss. I can't make up my mind. I'm so confused. I go back and forth. I procrastinate. I do this and then I do that. I never sort of finish anything. A lot of those styles turn out, in my experience, to be defenses against taking conscious responsibility for the experience of limitation and loss. But we're exploring in these discussions the view that the experience of freedom is not caused by, but is invited by, an unconditional commitment to the truth of our experience. So we can realize that the experience of freedom turns out to be inseparable from the experience of loss and limitation on a relative level. So, in therapy, we might hold these contradictory views of development and fruition, no resolution, understanding that at any moment there's a choice around how we talk, at what issues we work with, what views we work from, no formula, knowing that all of our work will be limited. I'd like to shift the focus from this more abstract discussion to talking about some specific techniques and practices that I have found helpful in my work. And again, just a reminder that the intention in both of these views, although understood differently, is to dissolve the experience of the basic split. Developmental view, we dissolve the split between, let's say, good self and bad self. The fruitional view, we're working to dissolve the split between all of ourself, good and bad, confused and clear, with the larger context of awareness, which is always there. So one way to approach this is to consider that our process of maintaining a solid sense of self through self-absorption, which is based on the idea that we are problematic people, and the struggle to fix our problems while, as we have previously discussed, unconsciously making sure these problems never get solved. This whole drama, or project, is maintained by a number of steps that we could describe roughly as operating in a certain sequence. The first step is an attitude of fundamental aggression toward the truth of our experience, as we've talked about quite a bit now. The second step, a dissociative relationship to our immediate experience, and we'll focus on that specifically in our discussion on body awareness. Third step, adding self-referential commentary continually to moments of experience, so that we're always having an experience, and then in a fraction of a second, unconsciously, we all tend to say, I like it, I don't like it, what does that mean about me, if I'm going to get what I want, how is this evidence about my worth as a person, can I ignore it because it doesn't have any relevance to me? We're doing that thousands of times every day. The fourth step, linking moments of experience to one another, which then creates an experience of continuity, so we can have more sense of being this solid but therefore alienated self. Fifth step is chronic struggle, where we generate and maintain this claim that there's something really important that has to be fixed about ourselves or about life before we fully are present. And usually that struggle carries some quality that there's an apparent threat that we're trying to avoid. Our work then is to address these unconscious strategies, often first intellectually as a view and then experientially as practices. And it seems to work best to work somewhat from the top down, the more relative to the more fundamental, from the periphery inward. So I can perhaps just mention a few examples of practices that are associated with this intention to gradually dismantle our vivid appearance of being a problematic self. So beginning with the more superficial level of chronic struggle, one of the techniques that I use often that I have referred to could be called the worst fear technique, where I try to have an intuitive sense of what is this person organizing their emotional life around not feeling? And then I invite that person to imagine feeling exactly that feeling. So it's very common that someone will present themselves as only self-sufficient, as competent, in control, on top of things. But they usually, of course, have complaints that are associated with that style that they can't quite understand. Well, I don't understand why I never feel supported. I don't understand why my partner always seems to be thinking of themselves and acting like a child. So with that person, I might say, well, how would it be to say out loud, perhaps secretly I'm an incredibly dependent person? A lot of times it's a very interesting response. Some people are horrified. Some people just crack up. Some people get sort of puzzled. What does that mean? Some people forget immediately even the words. But most people have a very vivid response if they're invited to give words to just the words of taking ownership of an aspect of themselves that they've dedicated their life to trying to stay away from as far as possible. So I've found that saying those words out loud, especially in the presence of another person, is very powerful. It's more powerful than just doing it privately. So I will frequently suggest things that people can say. Again, the point is not that this is a description of my true nature or something. The point is that this is an emotional experiment, a little emotional exercise, inviting more out into the open exactly what we have organized our life around not feeling, because historically it was probably a threat to feel those feelings. I often talk with people also about what would happen if you relaxed your sort of struggle, if you weren't always trying to get to a meeting on time, and you always feel held up by your partner or by your kids or by the traffic jam. Well, what actually is going to happen? And again, usually, of course, it turns out in the sort of fortunate life circumstances most of us live in, that there's not actually going to be any serious consequence. Really, it just means that somebody's going to have to feel some feelings that they don't want to feel. So then, once again, I might invite them to actually feel those feelings. The second step, going downward, going inward, linking moments of experience, is addressed most powerfully by the practice of immediacy. So when somebody has a commentary that's going on, I will often interrupt and say, well, excuse me for interrupting, but what are you actually feeling right this moment? And then return to the story. That's fine. And then a few minutes later, what are you actually feeling right this moment? And I might continue to do that with somebody, especially who's very invested in their story, with somebody who has a little less sort of solid defense about staying out of their embodied experience. I might do that more consistently. But always the intention is to invite a non-interpretive, direct experience. What's happening right this moment? Is it a problem? So somebody's telling a story about a variety of problems they have, complaints. Well, yes, and in this moment, is there a problem? I'm not saying that to suggest that their life circumstance doesn't need to be worked with, but in that moment, the person is creating a sense that their life is a problem. Or if they're talking about themselves, like somebody might talk about low self-esteem. I have this horrible feeling that I must be inadequate. I'm always attacking myself. And, well, what are you actually experiencing right at this moment? I'm just curious. Well, my stomach's tight, or I feel sort of numb, or I don't know, I feel a little antsy. Well, is that a problem? Where's the harm that's actually happening right now? And on a deeper level, of course, well, where's the evidence of a low self-esteem in a tight stomach? The third step in the invitation to dismantle egoic process is to address self-referential commentary. So often I will challenge somebody's story to disrupt their sort of identity with their story. For example, somebody might present themselves as a victim. I'm always trying hard. Nobody understands. I'm always exhausting myself. I've been treated so unfairly. I'm kind to others, but they're rude to me. And I will often suggest to that person that, first of all, they seem to be positioning themselves as a victim, which they don't usually like because they are usually preferring to think of other people as wrong. But they often can say, yeah, I don't like that word, but yeah, that fits. And then I might suggest that actually positioning oneself as a victim is one of the most aggressive attitudes we can take in life. We are basically blaming others. We're telling them that we can't handle our own life and they need to help us, but then when they try to help us, we almost always yes but them and block them in their efforts. There's often some sadistic gratification in being a victim. So people get a little upset with the idea that their identity as being this poor, powerless, put-upon person might actually, at a deeper level, be an expression of their own rage and their aggressive energy, their selfishness. So I'm not saying that to prove to that person that that's really who they are. I'm using that discussion to begin to disrupt their unquestioned investment in their story about who they are, the way life is. When somebody is ready, it seems, I will also sometimes suggest that they just drop all commentary. So they may be describing an experience. I was really, frustrated in the traffic jam this morning. I was going to be late coming to my appointment here, and, I got really pissed off. Why can't da-da-da-da-da? And I might suggest, well, how would it be just to say, I'm angry with no attribution of cause, no explanation at all? How would that feel? What would it be like? You could try saying that out loud. I'm angry. Then what's that like? And if a person is interested, then I might suggest they even drop the I am part of it and just say anger. Again, this is directing somebody into immediate experience without being able to position their experience as if it's part of a larger drama, which almost always has a quality of being some type of problem or complaint. So my particular preference is to just invite people to feel the intensity of that emotion, that energy in their body, respect it, value it. It's a type of aliveness, actually. But to see what it would be like to have absolutely no explanation for their experience at all. Then the deep level of fundamental aggression is a very difficult sort of habit or attitude to just give up. It's at the heart of a lot of our unnecessary suffering and our identity dramas. And I've found, at least in my experience, that the most powerful approach to fundamental aggression is the practice of unconditional kindness. In our last session, we were talking about several unconditional practices. They're all very relevant to this level of work, but I've found that bringing a sense of kindness toward everything that I'm experiencing is actually very, very powerful. So I might encourage somebody to just interrupt their report about what's going on and so forth and ask, well, what would it be like to actually be kind to that feeling you're having right now? It looks like that was really hurtful, what that person said to you. What would it be like to be kind, to say yes to that experience? It seemed like you felt you were really, unfair to your kids yesterday. Well, what would that be like to feel kind to your unfairness? As somebody is willing to practice being kind unconditionally, which means toward everything, even if I'm being unkind, then the next moment I practice being kind to that. as I practice being kind, over and over again, the first thing that shifts might be that instead of being kind to a specific experience, I start actually having the sense that this kindness is an attitude waiting for any experience to arise. Next, we might actually start to realize at some point, I have all of these difficult feelings. They don't seem to just be going away, but whatever I'm feeling, I seem to be ready to be kind to it. And if I really start looking, I can see that this whole display of my experience, my anger, my grief, my rage, whatever, my depression, comes and goes, but the kindness is always there. And at some point, a type of shift can happen where a person can actually start to experience themselves as the activity of kindness, because that's what's always present. And it doesn't even matter what they're being kind to at that moment. It's not about addressing any specific experience. It's about developing an attitude that we bring to all experience, without exception. If somebody experiences this shift, almost always there's an incredible sense of relaxation, increased sense of trust in oneself, more open-heartedness, more sense of presence. It's a very powerful shift that can happen. I've put a lot of emphasis on this practice of unconditional kindness, but you might be asking, well, how do we do this? There's not a formula. We have to sort of feel our way, each of us, in our own unique way of doing this, but I could say a few things. It has to do, first of all, with a felt experience more than just mental clarity. There's a sense of yes. There's a sense of extension, almost energetic extension, where we're taking our sense of vulnerability and warmth to this experience. As a metaphor, it's almost like holding a young infant, where we are just spontaneously in a completely open-hearted state. It doesn't matter if that infant's driving us nuts and we can't sleep. That kindness, that love is still present anyway, in addition to our frustration, not instead of. So this practice of unconditional kindness has a very felt, emotional, extending, warm quality. It's a very active practice. It's not sort of like the clarity of just being aware of something, like a mirror. It's not that. It's very active. It's a very strong yes and inclusion. And it often is, of course, rather disturbing, because we're actually saying yes to things that we've spent most of our life trying to not experience. So these are just some specific practices that are relevant to the work of dismantling or dissolving our created sense of being a problematic, self-absorbed, solid self. And as I've said, in my approach, I alternate back and forth between doing the developmental work of exploring family of origin issues, gender issues, life experience issues, looking at increasing our capacity to set boundaries, to communicate and assert what we want, to have constructive conflict skills, to learn to listen, all of those practices which are so valuable in handling our experience well, and, as I said before, at a deeper level, increasing our tolerance of experiential intensity. But there's a constant alternation between that work and the return to immediacy, to embodiment, to kindness, to whatever is arising, which tends to put the developmental work in a type of tentative space, which I find very useful, so that somebody can do the work and not take it completely seriously. On the other hand, some people, especially spiritual practitioners, try to do only fruitional work, and it's very possible then to do what's called sometimes spiritual bypassing, where a person learns to dissolve their sense of disturbance into an experience of spaciousness and immediacy. But they're not actually engaging with some very real, messy human experience. Waking up is not about suddenly becoming skillful. If somebody wakes up, they don't suddenly know how to speak Swahili and play the piano. They also don't suddenly know how to have improved human relationships or to handle certain characterological issues that they have embedded in their conditioned history. So my bias is that if a person is experiencing some degree of wakefulness and wants to live in a cave or off by themselves, no problem, because they're not getting captured, and that's fine. But if somebody wants to live in society, if they're going to be a parent, a partner, maybe a teacher, or somebody trying to be of benefit to others, it's very important, in my opinion, to do our developmental work, to process our characterological issues. Because even though we might not be getting captured by those issues, people we relate to are being profoundly affected. So from that point of view, we can understand that we want to wake up for the benefit of other people. And part of being of benefit to other people is to sort of clean up our own act, to not be indulgent in unresolved patterns of experience that, while may not capture us, actually might affect other people in a potentially very harmful way even. So, as we do this work, as I mentioned in a comment about my personal experience in the last session, something that actually can happen is that we can actually experience a shift in our psychic, energetic center of gravity. On one side of this center of gravity, we still have to actually struggle on a certain level in an appropriate way. We have to make an effort because the baseline, what we return to, our default position, continues to be this very confusing, painful experience of being a problematic, divided self. So we do need to work on that. On the other side of this center of gravity, this bottom line, baseline, default position actually shifts to one of feeling quite open with, relaxed with, accepting of, at home with the truth of our experience, whatever it happens to be, whether we like it or not. A couple of metaphors. Carl Jung used the metaphor in talking about this shift of leaning back in a chair. Up to a certain point, if you relax your effort of leaning back in this chair, you'll return to where it was. The chair will fall back to its original position. If you continue exactly that same process and cross the center of gravity, then the chair is going to fall over backwards. It's the same process all the way through. It's not a different process. But at a certain point of change, then the display becomes really different, almost opposite. We could imagine climbing a mountain, a steep mountain. We actually have to make a lot of effort to climb up that mountain. If we relax our effort, we might metaphorically slide back down. But once we've reached the peak and are heading over the other side, our work isn't to struggle anymore, it's to cooperate with gravity, to relax. We come down the hill by relaxing and letting gravity and our bodies cooperate. So in a similar way, when this shift has happened, we cooperate with ourselves. We cooperate with life. And we find, strangely enough, usually, the experience that life is cooperating with us. It's a little mysterious how that might happen, but it seems to be a common experience. So, another very basic question that I ask that in some ways brings both the developmental and the fruitional together in a one little sort of type of communication that I like is that I'm always curious about why somebody is making the effort they're making. What is it they want? So somebody could say, I want to get rich, or I want to have a lot of sex, or I just want to be left alone and have some space to myself, or whatever. But I'm always curious, well, then what do you get if you get what you want? Well, then I wouldn't have to worry. Then I would, feel excited. Then I'd not feel so burdened. Well, then what do you get? What's the benefit of getting that experience? And I try to investigate as deeply as that person is capable of about what's behind that and what's behind that. What is it that you're actually wanting from all of these conditions that you believe will give you that experience? And what I usually find is that what most of us want is very, very basic, and from a fruitional point of view, actually is already always present. It's very rarely actually in the future. Let's say that a person in a relationship complains that there's a lack of connection, a very common sort of complaint. My partner is just busy at work, they don't initiate talking about their feelings, they're always off riding their bicycle, whatever, and I want more connection, I want more engagement. Well, why do you want that sense of connection? What will it give you? And what usually turns out to be the case is that that person is wanting a sense of connection with their own self, with immediacy, with life. And the reason, of course, that they are not experiencing that is because they feel split off from their own experience. But if somebody really wants connection, then why don't they perhaps look for that connection at all moments if that's what they want? Because even if we have an unavailable partner, it's still a quality of connection. So what I usually find is that when we go to some depth about what is it that I really want, that you really want, that we can begin to clarify what our intentions actually are, our highest priorities. At that point, it becomes a lot more clear that if that's really what we want, first of all, it would be helpful to bring into alignment with that intention our behavior, our thinking, our emotional processing, and even our relationship to awareness. Because as we bring our various levels of experience into alignment with our highest priority, of course, it's much more likely that that's what we will experience more frequently. When somebody becomes clear that it is possible to look for what we want at all levels of experiencing and at all times, then I suggest that they consider looking for what they want at every second, if that's their highest priority. Why would they not look for what they want? So if we want freedom, look for freedom every second, because it's already there. If we want a sense of nurturance, look for nurturance. It's always there. If we want a sense of space, it's always there. What can come out of this type of work is an increasing experience of an ability to have a good state of mind at all times, regardless of circumstances. Obviously, that has to be understood that a good state of mind then cannot be synonymous with feeling happy, because that's one of the circumstances that's going to change a lot. So a good state of mind, in my experience, has more to do with qualities of resilience, clarity, confidence, open-heartedness, taking things with a little humor, embodiment, things like that. And in my experience, it's very workable to cultivate more and more and more of that experience of well-being, of having a good state of mind at all times. And it's not at all necessary to wake up to have that experience. It's a very relative level experience that can be cultivated.